1938 law.
Every year, new chemicals are being added to our food or sprayed on crops. 90% of the prescriptions written today are for drugs which were unknown 20 years ago.
The action taken by a government official, Dr. Francis Kelsey, prevented a new drug, thalidomide, from being used by American consumers. Once again, a tragedy brought attention to the crucial need for changing the laws. The drug had been used in England and Germany to prevent morning sickness, with disastrous results.
At the time the application was submitted, there were perhaps 40 to 60 doctors reported as having used the drug. Later, when we went back to examine the company files, we found it had been distributed to over 1,000 doctors who had used the drugs, often without a great deal of control and often without adequate reports on the results.
I'm sure that
Had Dr. Kelsey allowed the drug to be released in the United States, it was estimated that some 10,000 deformed babies would have been born before the danger was known.
We appreciate what you've done.
The near disaster forced Congress to enact a major new amendment improving control and marketing of prescription drugs. Advisors to Kennedy recommended that he appoint the first special consumer assistant with direct access to a president. After Kennedy's death, Esther Peterson was appointed by Lyndon Johnson. She remembers her first press conference.
I'll never get one of these reporters said, so what are you going to do? And I said, well, I want everybody to know that the consumer thing's important. Well, how are they going to find out? Oh, my God, how are they going to find out? So I said, I'll have conferences. That's where the regional conferences started.
Over is really a magnificent instrument for the consumers to rally around and now finally to have really a real direct voice.
Can they write you? I said, of course. I want to hear from people. Where do they write you? And I thought, my God, where do they write me? I haven't even got an office. So I gulped and I said, the White House. And I thought, here's where I'm going to be fired. I don't even have an office there. But let me tell you, it was the best mistake I made. It was the mistake. I got back 3 days later. That was Friday, and then it was the New Year's, and I'll never forget. I had a cold one day. And do you know, there were boxes of letters in a little room that they had found for me over in the EOB. And you know what? I got friends to come, and we took those letters, and we put what was about packaging, what was about credit, what was about additives, and that's how we built the program, from the people.
For most people, the single issue that pulled together many themes of consumer reform was auto safety. The struggle between a young lawyer named Ralph Nader and General Motors became a vivid symbol of consumer protest. Nader claimed that GM's Chevrolet Corvair was unsafe at any speed.
Well, back in 1965, General Motors hired a private detective firm to follow me around because they'd read some of my articles in newspapers criticizing them. And they followed me right down to the Capitol one day and lost me in the Capitol. The detectives rushed up to the Capitol Guard and said, "Did you see a person by this description?" And the Capitol Guard said, "What are you doing here following someone?" And they were caught. And of course, there's a federal law that says anybody who tries to intimidate a congressional witness can get into serious trouble. So the newspapers started investigating. They called up all the auto companies and said, "Are you following this young lawyer?" And Ford said no, AMC said no, Chrysler said no, and GM said no comment. And that was the beginning of the end, and GM had to admit that they did this, and there was a big congressional hearing where the president of GM came down and apologized.
I am not here to excuse, condone, or justify in any way our investigating Mr. Nader. To the extent that General Motors bears responsibility, I want to apologize here and now to the members of this subcommittee and Mr. Nader. I sincerely hope that these apologies will be accepted.
With a $280,000 portion of the legal settlement from General Motors as seed money, Nader continued his crusade. If some perceived him to be Arthur, his knights at the Round Table were Nader's raiders, many of whom came to Washington direct from the college campus. The struggle for protection from adulterated meat, begun at the turn of the century, continued as LBJ honored Upton Sinclair.
Stand up, please.
He was then in his 90s, and I remember going up to him and said, "Well, Mr. Sinclair, here we go again." And he said, "There's no end to the fight, is there?"
In the tradition of the figures of the progressive era, Dr. Harvey Wiley, Florence Kelly, National Consumers League lawyers Brandeis and Frankfurter, Nader brought passion and a sense of urgency to consumer reform. He also brought an ideology, a bitterly anti-corporate view. As one observer noted, he looked under the hood of American industry and found an engine egregiously out of tune with his sense of moral accountability. The very word consumerism seems to have come into the vocabulary with Nader. The term suggested for the first time that consumer reform was an ideology rather than a pragmatically oriented movement.
And Mr. Nader, by his activities in Washington and by encouraging...
While other reformers placed their hopes for consumer protection on product testing and research, Nader's energies were directed more toward arousing congressional attention and action. As in the 1930s, consumer groups had been attracting new members and broadening their base. Among these groups, the American Council on Consumer Interests, the Consumer Federation of America, food cooperatives and credit unions, and groups such as those that took to the streets in 1973 to protest against